5 years ago, I posted a video that would change my life forever: why nobody plays the Egyptian gods. At the time, the Egyptian gods had much less support than they do these days. Since then, Konami has released over 20 different cards to support this theme. Despite this though, unfortunately, only a couple of those cards ever saw competitive use, and none of them were quite good enough to make Egyptian gods consistently playable at tournaments. In today's video, we're going to cover all of the Egyptian god support released in the TCG in chronological order, and talk about whether or not the cards were good or bad. In terms of which cards I count as direct support for the Egyptian gods, I'm referring to cards that mention Slifer, Ra, or Obelisk, of course, but also cards that directly mention Egyptian god and or divine beast. The first official Egyptian god support was Ra's Disciple, released in Dragons of Legend back in 2014. This is a card that says when this card is summoned, you can special summon up to 2 Ra's Disciple from your hand and or deck, cannot be tributed except for the tribute summon of Slifer, Obelisk, or Ra, and you cannot special summon monsters except by the effect of Ra's Disciple. I'll try not to be too hard on Ra's Disciple, but I will say that when it was released back in 2014, obviously it wasn't enough to make Egyptian gods playable. There is at least a plan with this card. You're trying to special summon it usually, and then summon 2 more copies of Ra's Disciple, and then you contribute all 3 of them for any Egyptian god. But in practice, this combo was pretty fragile and very inconsistent, and especially compared to the other decks of 2014, Ra's Disciple wasn't enough to make the Egyptian gods playable. Notably, in modern times, Ra's Disciple has actually seen some competitive experimentation outside of Egyptian god decks. Some branded players have given this card to their opponent with branded Expulsion to lock their opponent out of special summoning, but even in that case, it's only like the 3rd or 4th most popular card to special summon with Expulsion, so it ended up getting outclassed by other cards in that category, but I did want to mention it. Dragons of Legend also included Mound of the Bound Creator. Level 10 or higher monsters on the field cannot be targeted or destroyed by card effects. If a level 10 or higher monster destroys a monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard, the player who controlled the destroyed monster takes 1000 damage. When this card on the field is destroyed by card effect and sent to the graveyard, you can add 1 divine monster from your deck to your hand. Mound of the Bound Creator isn't terrible. It's pretty average, and I think for 2014, it was an okay field spell for the Egyptian gods. The main issue is that the searching condition for this card requires it to be destroyed, so if you're trying to actually add an Egyptian god card to your hand, it requires multiple cards to set it up, and then you still have to have cards to summon and tribute for that Egyptian god. I will say that this card has been pretty popular in a number of fan favorite casual decks. People have played this card in Malefics, for example, and Sacred Beast before Fallen Paradise released, and I think it's an okay card in casual play, even if it's not that good at competitive tournaments. Next up, we have the Winged Dragon of Ra Sphere Mode, which is probably the most used Egyptian god support card in all of Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Maybe not so much because it's being played in actual Egyptian god decks, but it just happens to be a very good card. This was released in 2015 in Duelist Pack Battle City. This card says cannot be special summoned, requires 3 tributes from either side of the field to normal summon to that side of the field, and it cannot be normal set. Then shift control to this card's owner during the end phase of the next turn. Cannot attack. Your opponent cannot target this card for attacks or card effects, and you contribute this card to special summon 1 Winged Dragon of Ra from your hand or deck, ignoring these summoning conditions, and if you do, its attack and defense become 4000. So there is a lot going on with this card, but primarily how this card is played in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh is that you are simply using it to tribute 3 of your opponent's monsters in a way that is very difficult to interact with. This card doesn't destroy, it doesn't target, it simply tributes 3 of your opponent's monsters, which helps you get over a lot of annoying cards. When this card was released, it was very difficult for your opponent to remove it from their side of the field before passing it back to you, but nowadays, and ever since 2017, you can simply link it away for any number of Link 2 monsters that people play. When you use this card as a generic piece of removal, you don't really care if your opponent gets rid of it. I mean, yeah, it's kind of annoying you gave them a free link material, but at least you removed 3 of their most threatening monsters. But if you are using this card to try and summon Ra, it can actually be a huge problem because you're never going to get it passed back to if your opponent has any generic Link 2s. Now, that's not to say that this card is bad in Egyptian god decks, and it even has some funny combos that we'll talk about later in the video, but just to be aware that it's not always a perfect way to summon Ra. In 2016's Millennium Pack, we got 2 new pieces of Egyptian god support, including Winged Dragon of Ra's 3rd form. We have the Winged Dragon of Ra Immortal Phoenix, a big monster that says cannot be normal summoned or set, must be special summoned by its own effect. If Ra is sent from the field to your graveyard while this card is in your graveyard, special summon this card. Cards and effects cannot be activated in response to this effect's activation. This card is unaffected by other cards' effects. You can pay 1000 life points to send 1 monster on the field to the graveyard. Once per turn during the end phase, send this card to the graveyard, and if you do, special summon 1 Sphere Mode from your hand, deck, or graveyard, ignoring these summoning conditions. Immortal Phoenix, while on the board, is pretty powerful. It's unaffected by other card effects, it has 4000 attack, and it even has a non-once per turn, non-targeting removal effect for opponent's monsters. But unfortunately, the awkward summoning condition and that terrible mandatory end phase effect really kill this card's potential. Immortal Phoenix kind of seems like it's meant to be a control card for Egyptian god players, but realistically, the Winged Dragon of Ra has almost always been played as a big, funny glass cannon card, so I'm not really sure what this card's purpose is supposed to be. Now, you might wonder, well, what if you play this card just in case the Winged Dragon of Ra is sent to the graveyard by an opponent's card, you know, as an extra form of defense, just in case your OTK doesn't work? The main problem is that this card is pretty inconsistent and it's very telegraphed. The Winged Dragon of Ra has to specifically go from the field to the graveyard for this card to trigger, and that means your opponent can pretty easily play around Immortal Phoenix as long as they have a couple banishing or bouncing effects. The other Millennium Pack Egyptian God support is the True Name. This is a very interesting normal spell card that says declare one card name, excavate the top card of your deck, and if it is the declared card, add it to your hand. Then you can add to your hand or special summon one divine monster from your deck. Otherwise, send it to the graveyard. It seems pretty obvious that by design, the True Name was never meant to be a competitively viable option for the Egyptian gods. It's just a big, fun, casual card that sometimes works. And while there are cards that can make this card pretty consistent, either by stacking your deck or by flipping your deck over with a card like Convulsion of Nature, the True Name realistically just isn't that good. It's a funny card, yes, but not really meant for competitive tournaments. Now, this might be a little bit surprising to some of you, but at this point, we have actually covered all of the cards that were released for the Egyptian gods by the time I made that video 5 years ago. Going forward, all of the cards that we're talking about were printed after that video was made, so if you're wondering why I didn't mention any of these cards in that discussion, that's why. They simply didn't exist. The first card to end the Egyptian god support drought was Dark Spell Regeneration in 2022. This is a trap card that says when an opponent's monster declares an attack, target one spell in your opponent's graveyard, set it to your field. You can banish this card from your graveyard and send one monster born from your hand or set on your field to the graveyard, special summon one Winged Dragon of Ra from your graveyard ignoring the summoning conditions, then you can send one monster your opponent controls to the graveyard, also send that special summon monster to the graveyard during the end phase. By 2020, battle traps were already pretty outdated, but also this card requires a spell card to be in your opponent's graveyard. You want it to be a good spell card, because if you're just stealing like a random archetype card that you can't use, that's not really that much value, you know? So this really is a card that requires a ton of setup, and like a lot of the cards in today's video, the payoff just isn't there. Dark Spell Regeneration is a fun gimmick card based on an anime moment, but in terms of actual playability, it's not that good. A few months later, in September of 2020, we got Legendary Duelist Rage of Ra, and this is where things really started to change. In this one set, we got 7 new support cards for the Egyptian gods, and as the pack name would imply, most of these cards are directly for the Winged Dragon of Ra. This really was Konami's first attempt at making a viable strategy based around an Egyptian god, and honestly, some of these cards are pretty good, at least in a casual setting. First up, we have 3 slime monsters, starting off with Reactor Slime. Reactor Slime says, during your main phase, you can special summon 2 slime tokens, Aqua, Water, level 1, attack 500, defense 500, set 1 Metal Reflect Slime from your hand, deck, or graveyard. It can be activated this turn. I think in a lot of ways, this was supposed to be an upgraded form of Ra's Disciple, a more modern version of that card at least. It is a level 4 monster that puts more monsters on your field, which you could tribute for your Egyptian gods. Now, in regards to that battle phase effect, it might look a little bit out of place, but it'll make sense in just a few moments when we take a look at Egyptian God Slime, also released in this pack. Guardian Slime is a level 10, 0 attack, 0 defense aqua monster, and it says, if you take battle or effect damage, you can special summon this card from your hand. During damage calculation, if this card battles an opponent's monster, quick effect, you can make this card gain defense equal to that opponent's monster's attack during that damage calculation only. If this card is sent from the hand or field to the graveyard, you can add 1 spell or trap from your deck to your hand that specifically lists the card the Winged Dragon of Ra in its text. Guardian Slime really does not make sense without context, so let's take a look at Egyptian God Slime. This is a fusion monster that takes 1 aqua monster plus 1 level 10 water monster. It must first either be fusion summoned or special summoned from your extra deck by tributing 1 level 10 aqua monster with 0 attack. This card can be treated as 1 or 3 tributes for the tribute summon of a monster. It cannot be destroyed by battle. Your opponent's monsters cannot target for attacks, and your opponent cannot target with card effects any monsters you control except Egyptian God Slime. So as you can see, Guardian Slime and Egyptian God Slime are 2 of the better cards in the Egyptian God deck. Many Ra decks, even in 2023, are going to play 3 copies of Guardian Slime, and that's because the card is just so consistently powerful. As long as you can find a way to deal effect direct damage to yourself, Guardian Slime can be special summoned, and then when it's on the board, you can instantly tribute it for Egyptian God Slime, not only summoning a monster that can be treated as 3 tributes for your Egyptian God monster, but also the Guardian Slime searches a spell or trap card when it hits the graveyard. Not to mention that, of course, if your opponent inflicts damage to you, this card will still summon itself, but it's a little bit more consistent if you try to find a way to do burn damage to yourself. Guardian Slime is a great card, and Egyptian God Slime is a cool card as well, and while these cards might not have been good enough to make the Egyptian gods good, they definitely were a big step in the right direction. Let's take a look at some of the spell and trap cards that they gave us in Rage of Ra so we can see what options we have to search with the Guardian Slime effect. Ancient Chant is a normal spell card that says, add 1 Winged Dragon of Ra from your deck or graveyard to your hand, and if you do, you can tribute summon 1 monster during your main phase this turn in addition to your normal summon or set. You can banish this card from your graveyard. If you tribute summon the Winged Dragon of Ra this turn, its original attack and defense become the combined original attack and defense of the monsters tributed for its summon. Now, I'm not going to be as nice to the other cards in this set, but I will say that I think Ancient Chant is one of the best Egyptian God support cards ever released. This really is a perfect card not only for the Guardian Slime combo, but also just for the Winged Dragon of Ra in general. With Guardian Slime, you want to special summon it and then tribute it for the Egyptian God Slime, and usually at that point you'll use the Guardian Slime to add Ancient Chant, because then you can activate this card, add the Winged Dragon of Ra to your hand, and tribute summon it over the Egyptian God Slime. Guardian Slime, Egyptian God Slime, and Ancient Chant didn't immediately solve all of the problems plaguing the Winged Dragon of Ra at the time, but they did help quite a bit, and I'm glad that Konami printed them. Let's take a look at some of the other spell and traps in the set though, and talk about those. Blaze Cannon is a quick play spell that says, 1 Winged Dragon of Ra you control gains the following effects until the end of this turn. This card's activation and effect cannot be negated. Here are the effects that it gives the Winged Dragon of Ra. This card is unaffected by your opponent's card effects. When an attack is declared involving this card, you can tribute any number of other monsters that did not declare an attack this turn. This card gains attack equal to the tributed monster's combined original attack until the end of this turn. And after damage calculation, if this card attacked, you can send all monsters your opponent controls to the graveyard. Blaze Cannon has one huge downside that you might not realize at first glance. So while this card's activation and effect cannot be negated, and while it does give Ra the unaffected by your opponent's card effects ability, this card is able to be chained to. So if your opponent has a way to remove the Winged Dragon of Ra in response to the Blaze Cannon, it's not really going to do that much because the protection effect isn't on the Ra yet. So Blaze Cannon, while it might initially look like a huge finisher, it actually ends up being kind of awkward in some matchups, because if your opponent has any removal effect for the Winged Dragon of Ra, they can simply chain it to the Blaze Cannon. Millennium Revelation is a continuous spell card that says, you can send 1 Divine Beast monster from your hand to the graveyard, add 1 Monster Born from your deck or graveyard to your hand. You can send this face-up card to the graveyard. This turn, you can special summon the Winged Dragon of Ra from your graveyard with Monster Born, ignoring its summoning conditions. But during the end phase of the turn this effect was activated, you must send that Winged Dragon of Ra to the graveyard. Millennium Revelation is an okay card that gets boosted quite a bit by how well it pairs with Guardian Slime and Ancient Chant. This card is usually played as a one-of in Winged Dragon of Ra decks because you can search it so easily, but realistically it's just fine. The final piece of support from Rage of Ra was Sun God Unification. This is a continuous trap card that says, if you control a monster whose original name is the Winged Dragon of Ra, you can activate this card the turn it was set. During the main phase, you can pay life points so that you only have 100 left. 1 special summoned Winged Dragon of Ra you control gains attack and defense equal to the amount of life points paid, even if this card leaves the field. Once per turn, you can tribute 1 Winged Dragon of Ra, gain life points equal to its attack on the field. You cannot activate both of this card's effects in the same chain. This card is just a little bit too specific to actually make sense even in a Ra deck. It does require you to have that special summon Ra on the board if you want to actually use it immediately, but I think most people found that when they went to build a Ra deck around this time that they weren't normally special summoning the Ra, they were normal summoning it, which made this card pretty useless. The release of Rage of Ra gave Ra an actual deck, but at the time people were really wondering when Konami would give cards to Slifer and Obelisk of similar power levels. Less than a year later, in June of 2021, we got 2 Egyptian God decks. The one new card that was in both of the Egyptian God decks was Soul Crossing. This is a quick play spell card that says, during the main phase, immediately after this effect resolves, tribute summon 1 Divine Beast monster. When you do, you can tribute a monster or monsters your opponent controls, even though you do not control them, but if you tribute summon this way, apply this effect. Until the end of the next turn after this effect resolves, you can only activate 1 card or effect per turn turn, not counting the effects of divine beast monsters. When it comes to Soul Crossing, I think it does its job well, but it is a pretty linear card, and it does have a huge drawback if you want to use it in the best way possible. The plan of tributing 3 of your opponent's monsters to bring out a god card on their turn is really cool in my opinion, but the restriction on this if you do that is ridiculous, and it makes it so that this card really limits your plays once it resolves if you are using it on the opponent's turn. But optimistically, this card can be used to basically turn Slifer, Obelisk, or Ra into sphere mode, which is pretty appealing, and Soul Crossing is one of the best cards for god card players for that reason. When you are going second, Soul Crossing is crazy good, tributing up to 3 of your opponent's monsters, and you avoid the restriction in the process. Soul Crossing might have not saved the Egyptian god cards, but it is a staple 3 of in any deck that features them. Slifer's version of Blaze Cannon is Thunder Force Attack. This is a quick play spell that says, this card's activation and effect cannot be negated. If you control a monster whose original name is Slifer the Sky Dragon, destroy as many face-up monsters your opponent controls as possible. Then, if you activated this card during your main phase, you can apply the following effect. Draw cards equal to the number of monsters destroyed by this effect and sent to your opponent's graveyard. Also, you can only attack with 1 monster this turn. Much like Blaze Cannon, your opponent can still chain cards to Thunder Force Attack. It's just that the activation and effect cannot be negated. However, while Blaze Cannon puts some effects on the Ra, Thunder Force Attack just wipes the board. You know, you are getting rid of your opponent's monsters with this, so if you use this and your opponent chains a way to get rid of the Slifer, while that does kind of suck because now you have to resummon the Slifer, at least the Thunder Force Attack will still resolve. It is only part of the activation condition that you have a Slifer the Sky Dragon on the board. You can still resolve this card even if it's not face up on the field at resolution. But even though Thunder Force Attack might be better against interruptions compared to Blaze Cannon, that doesn't necessarily make it a good card. One weird part about Thunder Force Attack is that I feel like it's not that good when you go first, because if you're able to establish a Slifer on turn 1, you don't really need this card's effect. Slifer's removal effect has really gotten better with age. I think it is one of the biggest selling points of the card, and I think it kind of conflicts with the Thunder Force Attack. Yeah, maybe you can get a little bit of value if your opponent summons a monster with more than 2,000 attack points and you need to destroy it, but it just doesn't feel like Slifer decks struggle with monster removal when they're able to go first and establish a Slifer. Thunder Force Attack seems like it's designed to help you go second because you get the draws if you activate it during your main phase only, but if you're going second, the main way you want to summon Slifer is by using Soul Crossing because tributing monsters is way better than destroying them, in which case the Thunder Force Attack might not even have any cards to pop after you summon the Slifer, which means unfortunately a lot of cards like this for Obelisk and Slifer are just much worse than they would be in a raw deck because you just don't have that baseline of consistency cards. The other new direct support card was Ultimate Divine Beast. This is technically a card that can be used on any Divine Beast, but it was included with the Slifer structure deck, probably because it includes Slifer on the artwork. This is a continuous trap card that says, when an opponent's monster declares an attack, you can discard 1 spell or trap, then target 1 Divine Beast monster in your graveyard. Special summon it in defense position, then change the attack target to it. During the end phase, if you control a Divine Beast monster, you can destroy all face-up cards your opponent controls that activated their effects on the field this turn. This card has a lot of issues. It only activates when an opponent's monster declares an attack, which is already very slow. It also requires you to discard a spell or trap card, which is ridiculous for 2 reasons. First, I don't see why this card restricts you to only discarding a spell or trap card, just to let people discard whatever they want. And second, I just don't think the effect is that powerful, so I don't think this needed a cost at all. Without the discard cost, it's pretty likely that this card still wouldn't have seen any play, but at least it would have been a little bit better. The last effect is cute, but it is way too telegraphed, and I feel like even the most casual decks wouldn't have an issue destroying this card or banishing it in main phase 2. Over in the Obelisk deck, we had Fist of Fate, a quick play spell that says, this card's activation and effect cannot be negated, of course. If you control a monster whose original name is Obelisk the Tormentor, negate the effects of 1 effect monster your opponent controls, and if you do, destroy it. And if you do that, for the rest of this turn, the effects of that monster are negated, as well as the activated effects and effects on the field of monsters with the same original name. Then, if you activated this card during your main phase, you can apply this effect. Destroy all spell and trap cards your opponent controls. I'll say this about Fist of Fate, when you activate this card, it really does feel like you are punching your opponent's monster with an Obelisk, and that is great. It is basically a Solemn Strike plus Called by the Grave plus Harpy's Feather Duster if it actually works, but many of the complaints that I had about Thunder Force Attack also apply here. A lot of the times when I use this card going first, it feels like a worse reverse Solemn Strike that just requires Obelisk on the board to be activated. While Fist of Fate doesn't target, which is an upside, it does have to negate the effect of a monster on the field, which definitely hurts its overall flexibility. The same deck also included Divine Evolution, a normal spell card that says this card's activation and effect cannot be negated. Choose one monster that you control whose original type is Divine Beast, or whose original name is either the Wicked Avatar, the Wicked Dreadroot, or the Wicked Eraser, except a monster already affected by Divine Evolution, and it gains 1000 attack and defense. Its effect activations and its activated effects cannot be negated. Also, it gains the following effect. When this card declares an attack, you can make your opponent send one monster they control to the graveyard, their choice. There's not too much to say about this card. It is just really slow, really awkward to use, and the effect is not that good. Of all of the cards we've seen so far that say this card's activation and effect cannot be negated, this is by far the worst. 1 month later, in King's Court, we got Thunderspeed Summon, and while this card isn't technically only Egyptian God support, Konami did specifically mention Slifer in the official product page, so I'm gonna count it. During the main or battle phase, immediately after this effect resolves, normal summon one level 10 monster, or if you control Queens, Kings, and Jack's Knight, you can apply this effect instead. Add one level 10 non-dark monster with question mark attack from your deck to your hand, then immediately after this effect resolves, you can normal summon one level 10 monster. So Thunderspeed Summon can add either Slifer or Sphere Mode to your hand and then summon it, and of course if you do add the Sphere Mode, you are allowed to tribute 3 of your opponent's monsters to summon it. Thunderspeed Summon is okay, it just happens to be stuck in the Arcana Knight archetype, which really isn't that competitive, so it never got a chance to see play at tournaments, although admittedly it does feel satisfying to Sphere Mode the opponent on their turn. It wasn't until September of 2022 when we would see more Egyptian God support in the TCG. The 2022 Tin of Pharaoh's Gods had 4 new cards. One of them was an OCG import, and 3 of them were supposed to be World Premiere cards for the TCG, but due to what I'm assuming was a supply chain issue in the TCG, these cards got printed in the OCG 5 days before the Tins were released, so even though these were supposed to be TCG World Premiere cards, they happened to get printed a few days prior in the OCG. Soul Energy Max is a normal trap card that says, if you control Obelisk the Tormentor, whose original attribute is Divine in your monster zone, tribute 2 other face-up monsters. Destroy as many monsters your opponent controls as possible, and if you do, inflict 4000 damage to your opponent. During the main or battle phase, you can banish this card from your graveyard, add 1 Obelisk the Tormentor from your deck or graveyard to your hand, then immediately after this effect resolves, you can normal summon 1 Obelisk. Every time I read this card, I just wish they had swapped the effects. If this card on activation added and summoned Obelisk, and then you could banish it in the graveyard to do that destruction effect, that would be pretty cool, and I think that would be a fun Obelisk combo. But as it stands right now, if you want to use this to search Obelisk, you're gonna have to send it with like Foolish Burial Goods. It just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me that the graveyard effect is meant to add and summon the Obelisk, while the on-field effect requires you to already have the Obelisk on the board. Soul Energy Max is pretty disappointing. The Breaking Ruin God is a quick play spell that says the activation of this card or its effects cannot be negated, nor can its effects be negated. Special summon 1 Obelisk the Tormentor from your hand or graveyard, and if you do, it is unaffected by your opponent's card effects this turn. If you tribute 2 or more monsters you control at the same time to activate your card or effect while you control Obelisk the Tormentor, you can banish this card from your graveyard, banish all monsters in your opponent's graveyard, and if you do, inflict 500 damage to your opponent for each. The main problem with this card is that it seems unnecessary. Obelisk already has a protection effect, and while it is cool to make it unaffected by opponent's card effects, if you're playing an Obelisk deck in 2022, you probably want more consistency or versatility. You're not looking for this big flashy effect. It's hard enough finding the Obelisk in your deck and then summoning it. You don't want another card that could potentially brick you if you don't draw it. Luckily, the Ra and Slifer card in the Tins were a lot better. So the True Sun God is a continuous spell that says when this card is activated, add 1 the Winged Dragon of Ra or 1 card that mentions it from your deck to your hand, except the True Sun God. Monsters except the Winged Dragon of Ra cannot attack the turn they are special summoned. Once per turn during your main phase, you can send this card from your field or 1 Winged Dragon of Ra Immortal Phoenix from your deck to the graveyard, then send 1 Winged Dragon of Ra from your monster zone to the graveyard. The True Sun God is a fantastic support card, and it's a staple 3 of in basically any Ra deck. There's no reason not to play it. On activation, you can either add Ra or any card that mentions it, which really does open up your options. If you remember, the other searcher that we looked at only searches the Ra itself. This can grab any piece of support though, just as long as it mentions Ra specifically. That being said, the second effect on this card is pretty good too. It's a way to actually summon the Immortal Phoenix, which prior to this card's release was a lot harder. starter. So I know it's going to sound weird, but I actually have no complaints with this. The final card we'll go over in today's video is the Revived Sky God, and to be completely honest, this is my favorite piece of Egyptian God card support. This is a normal trap card that says the activation of this card or its effects cannot be negated, nor can its effects be negated. Special summon one Slifer from your graveyard, then each player draws until they have 6 cards in their hand. You can banish this card from your graveyard, place one monster born from your deck or graveyard on top of your deck, then if a Divine Beast monster is in your graveyard, draw 1 card. This card has a huge flashy effect, but for the first time in today's video, I'll say that it's not that hard to set up. If you branded Fusion, you can send Elbaz and Slifer by using a Fusion monster that requires Elbaz plus a level 8 or higher monster, and now instantly you have that Slifer in your graveyard. And in regards to each player drawing cards, remember, you have control of when you use this, so if you go first, you can simply make sure your opponent is only getting 1 or 2 draws, and then you have the Slifer on the board, which is a floodgate, which should help you secure the game. This is a really fun card to play in casual branded decks, and if you have it and you have branded, I would definitely recommend trying it out. Is it the most competitive way to play branded? Absolutely not, but it is a pretty great way to play Slifer. Now this is mainly a TCG format video, but I will mention 2 cards that we haven't gotten yet, just because I'm sure people are going to ask about them. So we have the Creator of Light. This was released in 2011 in the OCG, but we have still not gotten it in the TCG. And this is a monster that says, cannot be normal summoned or set, must be special summoned from your hand by tributing 3 monsters whose original names are Slifer the Sky Dragon, Obelisk the Tormentor, and the Winged Dragon of Ra. This card's special summon cannot be negated. The player that special summons this card wins the duel. This card is obviously not meant to be competitively viable. Do not play this in tournaments. That being said, the artwork is crazy. This is hand drawn by Kazuki Takahashi. That's why the little signature is there. And it's a really cool boss monster that I hope we see in the TCG eventually. The other card we don't have yet is Magical Trick Mirror. This was released in April of 2022. It is a normal trap card that says, when an opponent's monster declares an attack, target 1 spell in your opponent's graveyard, set it to your field. You can banish this card from your graveyard and send 1 monster born from your hand or set on your field to the graveyard, special summon 1 Obelisk the Tormentor from your graveyard in defense position, and if you activated this effect during your opponent's turn for the rest of this turn while you control the special summon monster, all monsters your opponent controls must attack that monster if able. This is a much better version of a lot of the other really bad Battle Trap Egyptian God support cards, but that's not saying much. I believe this card is an anime reference, so they can only do so much with its effect, but it's not a realistic card. The Egyptian Gods are nowhere near competitively viable at this point, even after 20 plus support cards, but I do think Konami is going in the right direction with these support cards. I think the Revived Sky God and the True Sun God are really good support cards for this archetype, and I hope we see more cards like them in the future. In my opinion, Slifer and Obelisk still need consistency cards. It'd be cool to see a card that could maybe add any Divine Beast monster to your hand. For Ra, I would give the deck a way to set up Guardian Slime without having to resort to big, complicated combos to inflict damage to yourself on turn 1, and I think all 3 of the Egyptian Gods need more low commitment plays. At the moment, it's pretty all in if you're trying to win with them. Anyway, that is all for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I've been working on this one for a few weeks, so it took me a little bit longer than expected, but I'm glad to finally have it posted. If you like this video, make sure to check out the other Why Nobody Plays videos, but that's all for now. I'll see you later. Goodbye.